Thanksgiving had always been an awkward time for me. My husband's family barely tolerated my presence, and my mother-in-law, Eleanor, made no effort to hide her disdain. This year felt different, not in a hopeful way, but heavier, colder. When we arrived at her grand Victorian home in Westchester, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Still, I smiled and held my son Charlie's hand tightly, hoping he wouldn't feel what I did. The house was always immaculate. Eleanor prided herself on maintaining appearances. Family photos lined the entryway, documenting generations of the Campbell family. None of them included me, though Charlie appeared in a few, always positioned slightly apart from the others. My husband David squeezed my shoulder before walking ahead to greet his parents, slipping into the role he always played. Here, their perfect son, unmarred by his unfortunate choice of wife. "You're late," Eleanor said, her eyes flicking over me with a familiar disapproval. She wore an expensive cashmere sweater and pearls, her silver hair styled in a perfect bob. "Everyone's been waiting." "Traffic was terrible," I explained, helping Charlie out of his coat. "The Holland Tunnel was backed up for miles." She sniffed. "Perhaps you should have left earlier then." I bit my tongue, a skill I'd perfected over the last 8 years. Charlie hugged his grandmother's legs, and she patted his head absently, careful not to disturb her outfit. She reserved her genuine affection for David, embracing him warmly, telling him how much she'd missed him. The house was filled with relatives, David's sisters and their husbands, his cousins from Boston, his aunt and uncle who'd flown in from Chicago. I offered smiles and greetings that were returned with polite nods, or, worse, barely concealed, whispers. I'd grown used to being the outsider, the girl from Queens who'd somehow snared their golden boy. The fact that I'd built my own successful business meant nothing to them. As the guests gathered around the large dining room table, I noticed there were only name cards for everyone else. Mine and Charlie's names were absent. My mother-in-law then announced with a smirk that we'd be sitting at the small folding table, in the corner of the room, next to the patio door. "That's where you two belong," she said with an icy chuckle, loud enough for the entire family to hear. My heart sank as I guided Charlie to our exile, trying to hold back the tears that had started to burn behind my eyes. David frowned, but said nothing, taking his seat beside his father at the main table. His silence was a familiar pain. He'd long ago chosen the path of least resistance. "It's not worth causing a scene," he'd tell me later. "You know how she is." I tried to make light of it for Charlie's sake, handing him a roll and whispering that we were on a secret mission. But he didn't understand. He was 6 now, old enough to know when something wasn't right. His lips began to quiver, and his small shoulders shook as he began to cry silently, clutching my arm. The rest of the family ignored it, too busy carving turkey and pouring wine. I swallowed the lump in my throat, silently praying for it all to be over soon. "Mommy, why can't we sit with Daddy?" Charlie whispered. "Grandma needed to make room for everyone," I lied, squeezing his hand under the table. "We're special, so we get our own table." He wasn't convinced. His eyes, so much like mine, looked up at me with a wisdom beyond his years. "They don't like us, do they?" I couldn't bring myself to answer. Instead, I cut his turkey into smaller pieces and encouraged him to eat. The main table erupted into laughter at some joke I couldn't hear, and I noticed David's youngest sister, Melissa, glance our way with what might have been sympathy. She'd always been the kindest of the bunch, though never brave enough to stand against her mother. Eleanor's voice carried across the room as she told stories about David's childhood, his achievements at Princeton, his promotion at the law firm. The narrative was carefully curated to exclude any mention of me, as if David's life had continued uninterrupted by marriage. When she spoke of Charlie, it was always my grandson, or David's boy, never acknowledging his connection to me. The dinner dragged on. Charlie picked at his food while I forced myself to eat, knowing I needed strength for the drive back to our apartment in the city. I'd offered to bring a dish, a pumpkin cheesecake that had taken hours to perfect. But it sat untouched on the kitchen counter, dismissed by Eleanor as not traditional enough. When dessert time came, Eleanor brought out her famous apple pie, serving generous portions to everyone at the main table. She approached our corner with 2 small slices on paper plates, placing them before us without a word. The message was clear. We were an afterthought, unworthy of china plates or proper servings. I watched Charlie struggle to eat his dessert, with dignity, his small face composed in concentration. Something shifted inside me then, a fault line finally giving way after years of pressure. This wasn't just about me anymore. Every slight, every cutting remark, every deliberate exclusion was teaching my son that he was somehow less worthy. I couldn't let that continue. "Excuse me," I said, standing up. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steady and clear where I expected trembling. "Charlie and I are going to head home now." The table fell silent. David looked up, surprised. "But we haven't even finished dessert. Mom made your favorite apple brandy to go with the pie." "I don't think we're welcome to share in that," I said quietly. "Come on, Charlie, let's get your coat." Eleanor's face tightened with displeasure. "Don't be dramatic, Rebecca. You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm not the one who should be embarrassed," I replied, helping Charlie from his chair. "Thank you. For dinner. Charlie, say goodbye to everyone." "Goodbye," he said in a small voice, waving his hand. David pushed back from the table. "Hold on. I'll come with you." "Stay," I told him. "Finish your dinner. We'll see you at home." As I helped Charlie with his coat in the entrance hall, I could hear the murmurs from the dining room. Eleanor's voice rose above the others. "Well, she's always been oversensitive. I don't know what David sees in her." I zipped up Charlie's coat with shaking hands. 8 years of biting my tongue, of making excuses, of accepting less than we deserved. 8 years of watching my son absorb the message that half of him was somehow tainted. Something had to change. I didn't know what that change would look like yet, but as we walked to the car under a sky full of cold stars, I felt a resolution forming, hard and clear as crystal. As Charlie slept in the back seat during our drive back to the city, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd endured over the years. The windshield wipers pushed away the light snow that had started to fall, each swipe revealing and then obscuring the road ahead, much like my thoughts. I met David during my final year at NYU. I was studying graphic design while working 3 jobs to pay tuition. He was finishing law school on his parents' dime. We bumped into each other at a cafe in the village where I was sketching between shifts. He spilled his coffee on my sketchbook, and somehow that ruined page became the beginning of our story. David was different from anyone I'd ever dated. Polished, confident, from a world of privilege I'd only glimpsed from the outside. I grew up in Astoria with my mom after my dad left when I was 4. We lived paycheck to paycheck, but Mom made sure I had art supplies even when we couldn't afford new clothes. David found my background refreshing, at least at first. When he brought me home to meet his family 6 months later, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment I walked in. Eleanor took one look at my secondhand dress and the tattoo peeking out from my sleeve and decided I was beneath them. I was creative, which in her world meant unstable and unsuitable. I wasn't from their social circle, didn't have the right education or connections. The fact that I worked as a bartender to support myself while building my design portfolio was proof enough that I wasn't their kind. David defended me at first, but over time, he found it easier to ask me to change. "Could you cover your tattoo when we visit my parents? Maybe don't mention your mom's job. Can you try to talk more about subjects they'd understand?" Each request chipped away at who I was, but I loved him enough to try. When we got engaged, Eleanor didn't speak to David for a month. His father, Richard, was more diplomatic, but equally disapproving. The wedding was small. My choice, they told everyone, when really it was because Eleanor refused to invite her friends to see her son make such a mistake. My mom sat alone on my side of the church while the Campbell family filled the pews across the aisle. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs. But I was 24, in love, and stubborn enough to believe I could win them over eventually. After Charlie was born, things got worse instead of better. Eleanor criticized everything from my breastfeeding to the organic baby food I made. She bought him designer clothes I couldn't afford to replace when he outgrew them. She referred to herself as his real mother when she thought I couldn't hear, telling her friends how fortunate it was that he looked more Campbell than whatever she is. David's career at his father's law firm took off, while I struggled to launch my design business from our spare bedroom. He worked late most nights, leaving me alone with a colicky baby and a growing sense of isolation. When I was finally offered a major contract with a tech startup, David seemed more concerned about childcare arrangements than proud of my accomplishment. The real turning point came 5 years ago, when Richard had a heart attack. The medical bills were substantial, even with insurance. I overheard Eleanor crying to David about possibly losing their house, the one they'd owned for 40 years, where David had grown up. Without telling anyone, I transferred my savings, money I'd been setting aside for my own studio space, to pay off the medical debt. I arranged it through the hospital's billing department so they would never know it came from me. A few months later, when my design company landed a major account with a national retail chain, I used my first big payment to quietly help with their mortgage. David knew but swore to keep my secret. "They'd never accept help from you," he said, not recognizing how much those words hurt. "It's better if they never find out." For years, I'd been the invisible support beam keeping their family standing. When Melissa needed money for graduate school, I convinced David to help her, knowing the money was coming from my business earnings. When their summer home in Cape Cod needed repairs after a storm, I found the contractor and paid the deposit. Always in the background, always unacknowledged. Charlie stirred in his car seat, mumbling something about pie. I adjusted the rearview mirror to see his face, peaceful in sleep, unaware of the complicated web of resentment and obligation surrounding him. I'd done all this for David, yes, but also for Charlie, so he would have the extended family I never had, the security of belonging somewhere. But tonight, watching him cry at that folding table, I realized I'd failed him anyway. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Where are you? You shouldn't drive in this weather." I ignored it, focusing on the road. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the highway in white. Another text came through. "Mom says she's sorry if she offended you." The lie of it made me laugh out loud. Eleanor had never apologized to me for anything. David was trying to smooth things over as always, unwilling to confront the real issue. Our apartment was quiet when we arrived. I tucked Charlie into bed, kissing his forehead and promising him pancakes in the morning. He reached up to touch my cheek. "Are you sad, Mommy?" "No, baby, just thinking. About Grandma being mean. Children see everything." I sat on the edge of his bed, choosing my words carefully. Sometimes people don't know how to be kind to others who are different from them. That's their problem, not ours. "Daddy didn't help us," he observed sleepily. The simple truth of it struck me like a physical blow. "No," I admitted. "He didn't." After he fell asleep, I sat at my desk in the corner of our living room, opened my laptop, and began to work. Not on client projects, but on myself. I updated my resume. I looked at apartment listings in Brooklyn, where we could afford more space if it was just Charlie and me. I drafted an email to my attorney about custody arrangements. With each click, each decision, I felt lighter. Around midnight, I heard David's key in the lock. He came in smelling of bourbon and his mother's perfume. They would have had after-dinner drinks in the study, as always, complaining about my rudeness. You could have answered my texts, he said, hanging up his coat. Mom felt terrible. No, she didn't, he sighed, pouring himself a glass of water from the kitchen tap. Why do you have to make everything so difficult? It's just one dinner a year. It's not just one dinner. It's 8 years of dinners, holidays, birthdays, 8 years of being treated like something stuck to the bottom of your mother's shoe. And now Charlie's old enough to notice. You're exaggerating. Mom loves Charlie. She loves her idea of Charlie, the parts of him that come from you. She tolerates the rest, just like she tolerates me. David rubbed his temples. Can we not do this tonight? I've had a long day. And there it was, the same dismissal, the same unwillingness to see what was right in front of him. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to prove myself worthy of a family that had decided, before they even met me, that I never would be. I thought about how hard I'd worked, supporting them financially while accepting their disdain. I thought about Charlie, absorbing the subtle message that his mother wasn't good enough. I've had a long 8 years, I said quietly. David didn't seem to hear me. He was already heading toward the bedroom, loosening his tie. I stayed at my desk, looking out at the snow-covered city. Tomorrow would be another day, another opportunity to decide what kind of life I truly wanted, and what I was willing to sacrifice to get it. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke before anyone else. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street below. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake David, and made coffee in the kitchen, watching the snow continue to fall outside our window. The city looked peaceful under its white blanket, hiding all the grime and noise beneath. David had come to bed late, long after I'd pretended to be asleep. We hadn't spoken since his return from his parents' house. This silence between us wasn't new, but it felt different now. Heavier, like the snow piling up on the windowsill, accumulating until something had to give. I heard Charlie's bedroom door open, followed by the soft padding of his feet across the hardwood floor. "Morning, buddy," I said, pouring him a small cup of hot chocolate. It was our weekend tradition. He climbed onto a stool at the counter, his hair sticking up in all directions. "Is Daddy still sleeping?" "Yes, we should let him rest." Charlie nodded, blowing on his hot chocolate carefully. "Are we going to Grandma's house again today?" My stomach tightened at the thought. Eleanor had invited, or rather instructed, us to join them for leftovers and a visit to the holiday market in town. Not today. I thought maybe we could do something just the three of us instead. "Good," Charlie said with surprising firmness. "I don't like it there." I studied my son's face, seeing so much of myself in his serious brown eyes and stubborn chin. "Why not?" He stirred his hot chocolate, considering his answer with the careful deliberation of a child who has learned to navigate adult tensions. "Grandma looks at you mean, and she puts us at the baby table." "The baby table," I repeated, trying to keep my voice light. "That's what Uncle James called it. He told Aunt Melissa that Grandma put us at the baby table because you don't know how to act at dinner." My hands gripped my coffee mug so tightly I thought it might shatter. James was David's brother-in-law, married to his oldest sister, Catherine. He'd always been Eleanor's devoted supporter, eager to enforce the family hierarchy. "I see," I managed to say. "Well, Uncle James is entitled to his opinion." "What does entitled mean?" "It means..." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "It means he can think what he wants, even if it's not very nice or true." Charlie nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. "Can we make pancakes?" "Absolutely." We were mixing the batter when David emerged from the bedroom, dressed in sweats and a Harvard t-shirt, his hair almost as disheveled as Charlie's. He kissed the top of Charlie's head but didn't approach me. "Smells good," he said, pouring himself coffee. "We're having a pajama day," Charlie announced. And we're not going to Grandma's. David's eyebrows shot up. What do you mean? Mom's expecting us around noon. I thought we could skip it this year, I said, keeping my voice neutral for Charlie's sake. Maybe go to the museum or catch a movie instead. After last night, you want to insult her again? David lowered his voice, but his irritation was clear. She called me 3 times this morning already. I'm sorry your mother is upset, but I'm not taking Charlie back there today. Is this because of the seating arrangement? She explained that it wasn't a seating arrangement, I hissed, mindful of Charlie's attentive ears. It was a deliberate humiliation, and it's not just about last night. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. A gesture I once found endearing, but now recognized as a sign he was preparing to dismiss my concerns. You're being oversensitive. Mom is from a different generation. She doesn't always express herself well. She expresses herself perfectly clearly, I retorted. And now Charlie's old enough to understand what she's saying. Grandma puts us at the baby table because we don't know how to act, Charlie piped up, repeating Uncle James's words. David looked genuinely surprised. Who told you that? Uncle, James told Aunt Melissa. David's face flushed. He shouldn't have. But that's what everyone thinks, isn't it? I asked quietly. That I'm some uncouth outsider who doesn't belong at the adults' table? And now, by extension, our son doesn't either? That's ridiculous, David protested, but his eyes slid away from mine. Is it? Then why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you insist we sit with you? Charlie looked between us, his small face pinched with worry. I forced a smile. Hey buddy, why don't you go pick out a movie for us to watch after breakfast? Once he was out of earshot, David's defensive posture softened slightly. Look, I know my mother can be difficult. Difficult? David, she's been actively hostile. To me from day one. She treats me like an interloper who stole her precious son. And now she's starting to treat Charlie the same way. That's not fair. She adores Charlie. She tolerates the parts of him that remind her of you, I corrected. But he's half me too. And every time she dismisses me, she's dismissing half of him. David poured more coffee, avoiding my gaze. What do you want me to do? Cut off my entire family because my mother isn't warm enough to you? I want you to stand up for us, I said, feeling the weight of years of silence crushing down. I want you to be on our side, just once. To tell your mother that when she disrespects me, she disrespects you too. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple, I insisted. You're choosing the path of least resistance, as always. It's easier to ask me to endure her cruelty than to confront her about it. David slammed his mug down, coffee sloshing over the rim. You have no idea what you're asking. My family has certain expectations, certain traditions. Traditions like making your wife and son eat at a folding table while everyone else enjoys the holiday together. You're blowing this way out of proportion. I laughed without humor. Am I? Do you know what Charlie asked me last night? He asked why they don't like us. Not me, us, because he feels it too now. David had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'll talk to Mom. She doesn't mean to make Charlie feel unwelcome. That's exactly what she means to do, I said softly. And you know it. The pancakes were forgotten, the batter congealing in the bowl. Charlie came back with a DVD, his expression uncertain as he sensed the tension in the kitchen. Hey, sport, David said with forced cheerfulness. What movie did you pick? While they discussed superheroes, I stepped away to check my phone. 3 missed calls from Eleanor, followed by a text message that made my blood boil. David tells me you're refusing to come today. Your childish behavior is embarrassing him. We raised him better than to tolerate such disrespect. Each word was a deliberate jab, designed to put me in my place. She'd never acknowledged that she was the one who had behaved inappropriately. In her world, the problem was always me. My background, my manners, my unwillingness to accept my designated role as an outsider. I set the phone down and joined my son and husband on the couch, but my mind was elsewhere. For 8 years, I'd tried to prove myself worthy of acceptance. I'd swallowed insults, made excuses, even financially, supported my in-laws in secret, all while allowing them to treat me as less than. And what had it gotten me? A husband who couldn't stand up to his mother, a son who was beginning to absorb the same toxic messages, and a life spent constantly apologizing for taking up space. Something had to change. Not tomorrow, not next week, but now. I couldn't keep living in this halfway state, neither fully accepted nor brave enough to walk away. When the movie ended, David announced he was going to his parents' house, with or without us. It's important to maintain family connections, he argued, especially for Charlie's sake. What about our family? I asked. The 3 of us? Isn't that important too? Of course it is, but your mother's feelings matter more than mine, I finished for him. They always have. David grabbed his coat, frustration etched in every line of his face. I'll be back for dinner. Try to get over this by then. After he left, Charlie and I baked cookies and built a fort in the living room with blankets and chairs. We read books and played board games, creating our own little world where no one could make us feel small or unwanted. But beneath my smile, a decision was forming. I couldn't change the Campbells. I couldn't make them accept me or respect me. I couldn't even make David see how his passivity was hurting us. The only thing I could change was myself. And what I was willing to accept. David returned from his parents' house well after dinner, his expression clouded. Charlie was already asleep, worn out from our day of indoor adventures. I was sitting at my desk, finalizing a logo design for a new client, when I heard his key in the lock. You missed dinner, I said without looking up. Mom insisted I stay. He hung his coat in the hall closet and loosened his scarf. We need to talk. Something in his tone made me close my laptop. About? My parents are selling the house. He poured himself a whiskey from the cabinet, not offering me one. They've been struggling financially for years, apparently. Dad's medical, bills, the repairs on the Cape House, Melissa's tuition, it's all caught up with them. I kept my face carefully neutral. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? He studied me over the rim of his glass. Because they seem to think you already knew. My heart skipped a beat. Why would they think that? Something about a letter from their bank. Mom found it when she was looking for property tax records. He took another sip. It mentioned a series of payments that cleared their mortgage, payments that came from a company called RLM Designs. My company, the one I'd built from nothing, working nights while Charlie slept, taking on projects others wouldn't touch. I'd named it for myself and my mother, Rebecca Lynn Marquez, a small tribute to the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities. That's a coincidence, I offered weakly. Is it? Because when Mom Googled RLM Designs, guess whose face came up on the website? David's voice was eerily calm. You've been paying my parents' mortgage. For how long? I closed my eyes briefly. 5 years, since your dad's surgery. And his medical bills, the Cape House repairs, Melissa's graduate program? Yes. David placed his glass down with deliberate care. Why would you do that? Why would you give them money in secret? Would they have accepted it if they knew it came from me? His silence was answer enough. I did it for you, I continued quietly, because I knew how much your family's security meant to you. And I did it for Charlie, so he'd have grandparents with a stable home, holidays in the same place you grew up. So your design business, the one you said was just breaking even, has actually been successful enough to support my entire family. I nodded slowly. I didn't want to make you feel Inadequate. You were already upset that I was working instead of staying home with Charlie. Jesus, Rebecca. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now recognized as a sign of his discomfort with emotional complexity. Do you have any idea what you've done? Helped your family without asking for credit or gratitude? Yes, I'm aware. You've humiliated them, he snapped. My mother was in tears. My father barely spoke all afternoon. They feel like charity cases. That wasn't my intention. What was your intention then? To hold this over their heads someday? To prove you're better than them? The accusation stung like a slap. I never planned for them to find out. I just wanted to help. Well, congratulations. Now they know exactly what you think of them, that they're so pathetic they need handouts from the daughter-in-law they never wanted. I stood up, anger finally breaking through my careful composure. That's not fair. I've spent 8 years trying to be accepted by your family. I've changed how I dress, how I speak, what I talk about. I've swallowed every insult and endured every slight. And when I saw a way to help them without wounding their precious pride, I took it. You lied to everyone, including me. I protected everyone's feelings, including yours. I moved to the window, watching snow fall on the city streets below. Your mother would rather lose her home than accept help from me directly? We both know that. David was quiet for a long moment. They want to meet with us tomorrow. Both of us. My stomach dropped. Why? Mom wouldn't say. Just that they have a lawyer coming at noon, and we need to be there. A lawyer? Panic fluttered in my chest. Are they suing me? I don't know. David sounded exhausted. Possibly. Or maybe they just want to formalize the loan repayment. It wasn't a loan. It was a gift. Well, they don't see it that way, and frankly, neither do I. That night, we slept with a chasm between us in our bed. David's back was turned to me, his breathing never settling into the deep rhythm of sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the years of slights and sacrifices, wondering how trying to help had become my greatest offense. Morning came too quickly. We moved around each other like strangers, careful not to touch as we dressed and prepared. Charlie for a day with my mother. I called her early, explaining we had an emergency meeting but offering no details. She agreed to watch Charlie without question, one of the many ways she supported me without judgment or conditions. The drive to Westchester was silent except for the occasional direction from the GPS. When we pulled up to the Grand Victorian House, several cars were already parked in the driveway, including one with a corporate logo I didn't recognize. Looks like the whole family's here, David muttered. Perfect, I said, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. Eleanor opened the door before we could ring the bell. Her face was carefully composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. Come in, she said stiffly. Everyone's in the dining room. The formal dining room, scene of countless humiliations, was filled with familiar faces. Richard sat at the head of the table, looking smaller somehow, his proud posture diminished. David's sisters, Catherine and Melissa, were there with their husbands, all wearing expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. And at the opposite end, from Richard sat a man I didn't recognize, neatly dressed in a charcoal suit, a leather portfolio open before him. Rebecca, David, Richard acknowledged us with a nod. Please sit down. The only 2 empty chairs were directly across from the stranger. I sat, folding my hands in my lap to hide their trembling. This is Mr. Thornton, Eleanor said, her voice brittle. Our attorney. Mr. Thornton adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. Mrs. Campbell, I understand there's been some confusion regarding certain financial transactions between you and your in-laws. I wouldn't call it confusion, I began, but David cut me off with a hand on my arm. "We're here to listen," he said firmly. Mr. Thornton nodded and opened a folder. "I've been reviewing the Campbell family's financial records, and it appears that over the past 5 years, significant sums have been transferred to their accounts from RLM Designs, a company registered in your name." "That's correct," I admitted. "These transfers were made without the knowledge or consent of Mr. and Mrs. Campbell." "Also correct." Eleanor made a small sound, something between a scoff and a sob. Catherine, always her mother's ally, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Under normal circumstances," Mr. Thornton continued, "this might constitute financial impropriety. However, given your relationship to the family, we're prepared to handle this as a private matter." "I wasn't trying to hide anything," I said, finding my voice at last. "I was trying to help without making them feel indebted to me. I knew they wouldn't accept direct assistance." "And why might that be?" Eleanor asked coldly. Before I could answer, Mr. Thornton raised a hand. "If I may continue, the total amount in question is substantial, just over $480,000 over 5 years. A collective gasp went around the table. Even David looked shocked at the figure. "In light of this situation," Mr. Thornton went on, "the Campbells have decided to sell their home immediately and use the proceeds to repay you in full." "That won't be necessary," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tension gripping the room. "As I said, the money was a gift. I don't want or expect repayment." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Of course you don't. How magnanimous of you to bestow your charity upon us." "It wasn't charity," I insisted. "It was family helping family." "We are not your family," she snapped, color rising in her cheeks. "We never asked for your help." "No, you'd rather lose your home than except that I might actually care about what happens to you." I looked around the table at the faces watching this exchange with varying degrees of discomfort and hostility. "Do any of you understand what family really means? It's not about status or appearances. It's about supporting each other without keeping score." Catherine leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping the table. "That's rich coming from someone who's obviously been keeping very careful score. Why else would you track every penny you've given if not to throw it in our faces someday? I run a business. I keep records. That doesn't mean I expected anything in return." "Except our gratitude?" Eleanor suggested bitterly. "Our approval? Is that what this was about? Buying your way into our good graces?" I felt David tense, beside me but kept my focus on his mother. "If that was my goal, I clearly failed spectacularly. No, Eleanor. I helped because I could, and because despite everything, you're my son's grandparents. I wanted him to have what I never did, an extended family, traditions, security." Richard spoke for the first time, his voice rough with emotion. "We would never have accepted if we'd known. I know. That's why I did it the way I did." Mr. Thornton cleared his throat. "Regardless of intent, the fact remains that these substantial sums were transferred without disclosure. The Campbells wish to clear the debt." "There is no debt," I insisted. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," David suggested, finally finding his voice. "This is between Rebecca and my parents." "Actually," Mr. Thornton interjected, "there's another matter we need to address." He pulled out a second folder from his briefcase. "It concerns the house itself." A strange silence fell over the room. I noticed Eleanor and Richard exchange a look that I couldn't quite interpret. 3 months ago," Mr. Thornton continued, "this property was sold through a quiet title transfer. The new owner is Horizon Investments, LLC. He slid a document across the table toward me. "A company that, according to my research, you established last year, Mrs. Campbell." I felt all eyes in the room turn to me. David's gaze was particularly intense. "That's correct," I admitted. "You bought my parents' house?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Without telling anyone?" I took a deep breath. When I learned they were considering selling, I made arrangements to purchase it through a holding company. I intended to transfer ownership back to them once certain tax advantages had been realized. This wasn't entirely true. I'd purchased the house to ensure it wouldn't be lost, yes, but I'd also done it to secure something for myself and Charlie, a safety net if my marriage continued to deteriorate, a piece of leverage in a world where I'd always been powerless. "So, you own this house," Eleanor said flatly. "Right now, legally, this house belongs to you." I nodded slowly. "We're living here on your charity," she continued, each word dripping with disdain. "I never intended to disrupt your lives," I said. "The plan was to transfer ownership back to you after the new year, once the tax benefits were secured." "And we're supposed to believe that?" Catherine interjected. Mr. Thornton adjusted his glasses. "The documentation supports Mrs. Campbell's claim. There are draft transfer papers already prepared, dated for January of next year." A tense silence filled the room. I could feel David's eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. "I think," Richard said slowly, "we need a moment alone. As a family." Mr. Thornton gathered his papers. "Of course. I'll be in the study when you're ready to continue." After he left, the silence grew even heavier. I stared at the gleaming surface of the dining table, noting absently that it was the same one where I'd been denied a place so many times. "Why?" David finally asked. "Why would you do this?" "Because I was tired of being powerless," I answered honestly. "Tired of watching your family treat me like an intruder while accepting my help through the back door. Tired of you never standing up for me." I finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "I bought this house to make sure it wouldn't be lost, yes, but also to have something that was mine in a world where I've always been made to feel like I don't belong." Eleanor's laugh was cold. "So it was revenge?" "No. It was self-preservation." Richard placed his hands flat on the table. "What do you want, Rebecca? What's your end game here?" "Originally, to help secure your home and eventually give it back to you. But now..." I glanced around the table at the family that had never accepted me. "Now I want acknowledgement. I want you all to recognize that I've been part of this family for 8 years, contributing financially and emotionally, only to be treated like an unwelcome guest." "You could have just asked for respect," Melissa offered quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken, and heads turned in surprise. "Instead of this." "I did ask. For 8 years. I asked with every kind word, every holiday gift, every attempt to fit into your world. And what did I get in return? A folding table in the corner while my son cried." David's face flushed with shame, but he said nothing. "So, what now?" Catherine demanded. "You throw us out of our family home? Is that your grand plan?" "No one's being thrown out," I said firmly. "The house is legally mine, yes, but I have no intention of disrupting your lives." "How generous," Eleanor muttered. I ignored the sarcasm. "But things need to change. I won't continue to accept disrespect, for myself or for Charlie. If we're going to be a family, then we need to be one in reality, not just when it's convenient." Richard leaned forward, his expression grave. "And if we can't meet your demands, what then? Then David and I have some serious decisions to make about our future and about what kind of family environment we want for our son." The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor looked away, her rigid posture the only sign of her distress. Catherine and her husband exchanged uncomfortable glances. Melissa studied her hands. Richard seemed suddenly older, the weight of the situation etched in the lines of his face. "You've been planning this," David said, his voice holding a note of realization. "For how long?" "I've been running a successful business for years, David," A business you barely acknowledged because it didn't fit your idea of what your wife should be doing. I've been handling our finances while you worked 80-hour weeks at your father's firm. And yes, I've been making contingency plans because I never felt secure in this family. Did you ever consider just talking to us? Melissa asked, her voice gentle compared to the others. I gave her a sad smile. Would anyone have listened? The room fell silent again as the truth of my words sank in. For years, I'd tried to earn a place at this table through traditional means, through kindness, through patience, through conformity. None of it had worked. It had taken financial power, the language the Campbells truly understood, to finally make them see me. I think, David said slowly, we need to take a step back. All of us. This isn't something we can resolve in one morning. I agree, I said. But understand this, I'm done being invisible. From now on, I expect to be treated with the same respect given to any other member of this family. And more importantly, I expect Charlie to be treated like he fully belongs, not as some half-accepted outsider. Eleanor started to speak, but Richard placed a hand over hers, silencing whatever cutting remark she'd been about to make. We hear you, Rebecca, he said with unexpected dignity. And perhaps we have some reflecting to do. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever received from any of them. I nodded, accepting it for what it was, a beginning. David stood. I think we should go. Give everyone time to process. As we prepared to leave, I paused in the entryway where family photos lined the walls, years of Campbell history displayed proudly, with no trace of me except in the few pictures of Charlie, where I'd been carefully cropped out. One more thing, I said, turning back to the family that had gathered to see us out. Next Thanksgiving, everyone sits at the same table. Or no one does. A year passed, bringing changes both subtle and profound. David and I spent months in marriage counseling, unpacking years of unspoken resentments and misaligned expectations. There were weeks when I wasn't sure we'd make it. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd gone too far, pushed too hard. But slowly, like a ship changing course, our relationship began to find a new direction. David transferred to a smaller law firm in Brooklyn, one that valued work-life balance and allowed him to be home for dinner most nights. I expanded my design business, hiring 2 junior designers and moving into a proper office space in Soho. Charlie started first grade at a progressive school where he thrived, making friends and developing an unexpected talent for storytelling. My relationship with the Campbells evolved too, though not without setbacks. Eleanor maintained a cool distance, but the open hostility had faded to something more like wary acceptance. Richard made more effort, occasionally calling to ask about my business or Charlie's activities. Melissa became an unexpected ally, inviting me for coffee and admitting she'd always admired my resilience. As for the house in Westchester, I kept my word. In January, I transferred ownership back to Richard and Eleanor, with a legal stipulation that it could not be sold without my consent during Charlie's minority years. It wasn't about control, I explained to David, but about ensuring stability for our son. When November arrived again, bringing with it the familiar weight of holiday expectations, David and I faced a decision. Eleanor had extended the usual Thanksgiving invitation, though with noticeably less imperious phrasing than in previous years. We don't have to go, David said as we discussed it over dinner one night, after Charlie had gone to bed. We could start our own tradition, just the 3 of us, or maybe include your mom. I considered this as I sipped my wine. Actually, I think we should go. He raised an eyebrow. You're sure? After everything? I'm not surrendering, I clarified. I'm choosing to give them another chance. But this time, on equal terms. The day before Thanksgiving, I did something I'd never done before. I called Eleanor directly. Our conversation was stilted at first, cautious on both sides. I'd like to bring something tomorrow, I said after the initial awkward greetings. Not just a side dish, but something significant. There was a pause before she answered. What did you have in mind? I make a really good bourbon pecan pie. It was my grandmother's recipe. Another pause, longer this time. We usually have apple and pumpkin. I know, but I thought maybe we could add something new to the tradition. Something from my family. The silence stretched between us, laden with years of resistance and rejection. Finally, she sighed. All right, bring your pie. It wasn't exactly enthusiastic, but it was permission, something she'd never granted me before. The next day, as we drove to Westchester with Charlie chattering excitedly in the back seat and my carefully wrapped pie on my lap, I felt a strange mix of determination and hope. David reached over to squeeze my hand at a stoplight. Whatever happens today, he said, we're in this together. Really together this time. I squeezed back, grateful for this new version of my husband who had finally learned to stand beside me, rather than between me and his family. When we arrived, Richard opened the door instead of Eleanor, a small but noticeable change from the usual routine. He welcomed us with a warmth that seemed genuine, if somewhat unpracticed. Come in, he said, taking our coats. Charlie, your cousins are in the den playing that video game you like. Charlie looked up at me, seeking permission. I nodded, and he darted off, leaving us adults in the entryway. Rebecca, Richard said, his voice lower now that Charlie was gone. I want you to know that Eleanor and I have given a lot of thought to everything. It hasn't been easy for her to face certain truths about her behavior. It hasn't been easy for any of us, I acknowledged. He nodded. Indeed, but we're trying. That counts for something, doesn't it? Before I could answer, Eleanor appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. Her hair was less rigidly styled than usual, her expression cautious but not hostile. You're here, she said, stating the obvious. Her eyes fell to the pie in my hands. Is that bourbon pecan? I confirmed. My grandmother's recipe. She nodded once. The dessert table is in the dining room. There should be space next to the pumpkin. I followed her direction, noting with satisfaction that the dining room had been rearranged. Instead of separate tables, there was one long table stretching the length of the room, with places set for everyone. No folding table in the corner, no exile for unwanted guests. As I placed my pie on the dessert table, I noticed something else. A framed photograph I'd never seen before. It showed David and me on our wedding day, Charlie between us, all three of us laughing at something off camera. It had been taken by my mother, one of the few candid shots from that tense day. We found it in David's old things, Melissa said, coming up beside me. Mom didn't want to put it up at first, but Dad insisted, said it was time to acknowledge all members of the family. I touched the frame lightly, emotion tightening my throat. It's a start. The dinner itself wasn't perfect. Eleanor still made a few cutting remarks, though they seemed born more of habit than malice. Catherine remained cool, though her husband made surprising efforts to engage me in conversation about my business. Richard asked Charlie questions about school and actually listened to the answers. David, true to his word, stayed by my side throughout the evening, his presence a steady reminder that I wasn't alone in this anymore. When it came time for dessert, I held my breath as Eleanor cut into my pie, serving it alongside her traditional offerings. She took a small bite, her expression giving nothing away. It's quite good, she said finally. Different, but good. From Eleanor, this was practically effusive praise. David squeezed my knee under the table. After dinner, while the others moved to the living room for coffee, I found myself alone in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, watching me for a moment before speaking. You don't need to do that, she said, Catherine and I usually handle it later." "I don't mind," I replied. "It's nice to have a moment of quiet." She hesitated, then came into the kitchen and picked up a dish towel. We worked in silence for a few minutes, falling into an unexpected rhythm, me washing, her drying. "I won't apologize," she said suddenly. "I don't believe in empty gestures." "I'm not asking for an apology," I replied. "I'm asking for respect going forward." She nodded slowly. "I can try. That's all I can offer. That's all anyone can do." Another silence fell between us, less tense than before. As she put away the last of the dried plates, she paused, her back to me. "The pie really was good," she admitted. "My mother never could get pecan pie right. Too sweet usually." I smiled despite myself. "The bourbon cuts the sweetness. I could give you the recipe if you want." She turned, surprise flickering across her face. Yes. I'd like that." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't even friendship, but it was an opening, a small crack in the wall that had stood between us for so long. Later that evening, as we drove home with a sleepy Charlie in the back seat, David reached for my hand again. "That went better than expected," he said. "Your mother said my pie was quite good," I replied with a chuckle. "I think that qualifies as a miracle." He laughed, the sound free and genuine in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Baby steps." "Baby steps," I agreed. When we got home, I tucked Charlie into bed while David opened a bottle of wine. We sat together on our small balcony, looking out at the Brooklyn skyline, a world away from the Grand Victorian in Westchester. "I'm proud of you," David said after a comfortable silence. "For standing up for yourself, for making me see what I was doing and not doing." "I'm proud of us," I corrected, "for finding a way forward that works for our family. All of our family." He lifted his glass. "To new traditions. And to old ones worth keeping," I added, clinking my glass against his. As we sat there under the November stars, I felt something settle inside me, a peace I hadn't known I was seeking. The year had brought pain and confrontation, yes, but also clarity, and finally, a measure of acceptance. Not the desperate acceptance I'd once craved from the Campbells, but a deeper acceptance of myself and my place in the world. Thanksgiving would never be simple for us. There would always be tension, old wounds that could reopen with a careless word or gesture. But now there was also possibility, the chance for something genuine to grow in place of pretense. And for that, I was truly thankful.